welcome to Rising. We have a stupendous show for you today now that Brianna, the stupendous Brianna, is back with us. Nice to see you again.
It's good to see you. I'm sorry to have abandoned you. The only competition for your presence here on a Monday morning is illness. I succumbed, but I'm feeling much better today and happy to be back.
Well, we are so glad that you're feeling better. And what are we talking about today?
Well, Robbie, there is more bad news for Biden. A new Monmouth University poll showed the president's approval rating at a record low, just 34%, saying they approve of his performance in the White House. 61% of respondents said they disapproved of Biden's job performance. This drop in approval is buoyed by declines in support from Democrats and independents. And voters also give POTUS poor marks on several key policy issues, namely inflation and immigration, with just over 2 in 3 disapproving of the president's performance on immigration at 69% and inflation at 68%.
Watch as a Democratic pollster tells Jim Acosta to get out of the bubble, as the CNN host cannot fathom why Americans are still grumpy over high prices.
Question I have, though, is inflation is cooling. I mean, if you look at gas prices, they're going down. They're around $3 a gallon in the Washington, D.C. area, Maryland, and Virginia. I suspect it's fluctuates depending on where you are around the country, but generally coming down. People aren't feeling that enough just yet.
It's a bubble.
Yeah.
It's a bubble. People, look, what I have discovered in doing my polling in Europe, in the UK, and here, is what matters is how many months people have been struggling to deal with inflation. And each month they get madder and madder about it, as long as their wages are trailing prices. And
so they're grumpy right now.
There's still look, get out of the bubble.
Yeah.
They are it's 3% higher than it was when Biden came in. In the last 6 months, there's been a decline in disposable income. So the context is you have to start there. Inflation is like 30 points higher than the next problem. And you can't, what the president currently doing is his tweets always start with, we're making progress, and then he mentions prices. Mm-hmm. If you look at his ads aimed at black voters, it's mainly trying to convince them they're doing a good job. But that's not where they are. They are losing ground every month and anger about it. But then you have to stop. You have to say, what's the main problem? How do you deal with the first problem, which is inflation and the cost of living?
There's also this reporting from the Washington Post. Quote, Biden delivered some stern words for the small group assembled. His poll numbers were unacceptably low, and he wanted to know what his team and his campaign were doing about it. He complained that his economic message had done little to move the ball, even as the economy was growing and unemployment falling, according to people familiar with his comments, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss a private conversation. End quote. So Team Biden, or Biden himself at least, knows that something is wrong, that his message is not getting through, or people are hearing it and just disagreeing and just not satisfied that the situation has rebounded sufficiently since the pandemic.
Yeah, and this debate about how entitled people should be to feel bad about the economy or their personal economic status in the world right now has been boiling over on the broad left. So liberals and leftists have been at odds because there are a lot of liberals who see the complaints that a lot of leftists have been raising for years now about economic precarity, about how working people are getting a smaller and smaller piece of the pie. And they're saying, now's not the time to bring this up. Biden is on the edge. Suck it up. You're delusional. They point to these kind of broad macroeconomic trends. Inflation is down. They say gas prices are down. They say, why are you still complaining? But it's obvious why people are still complaining if you look at the metrics that normal people use to decide whether or not things are too expensive. Home prices have grown twice as fast as income since the year 2000. We all know that the millennial generation is the first to do worse off than its parents. We haven't had a raise in the minimum wage since 2009, which is the single longest period of time without a federal minimum wage raise since the invention of the federal minimum wage in the 1930s. This is where we are as a country at the same time that these pundits get on TV and say, there's nothing to see here, there's no problem. And you heard him specifically point to black voters. All right, well, 33% of black men are now saying they're interested in Donald Trump. Mara Gay wrote a piece for the New York Times in the last couple of days where she went down to Georgia, a key state for Joe Biden, and asked black voters there how they're feeling. Are they making up the idea that they're actually economically precarious? She went into one of these famous barbershop interview style formats and asked one guy, and he says, look, quote, bad as things were, people say they felt money was circulating with Trump in office. Those stimulus checks, this one guy said. Now there is no money circulating, prices are up, cost of food is up. She goes on to write, throughout the region, opportunities for jobs are extremely limited. Many voters told me they are forced to make a choice, working menial jobs for local businesses owned by a handful of white Republican families, fast food, or Walmart. Given the grinding poverty around them, some voters here also said the recent headlines about the United States sending billions to Israel to bomb Gaza are also hard to swallow. Quote, I think he should stay out of other people's business and focus more on problems at home, said one 33-year-old forklift operator in Georgia.
Yeah, that sentiment does not surprise me at all. It's the perception that our government, and really it's a bipartisan problem, cares about every other country more than the American voters, the American taxpayers. It's a long-running, accurate perception. It's hard not to come to that conclusion when wherever there's a crisis, there is the American dollars paying to defend and protect people abroad. So that's not surprising at all. Donald Trump now currently polling better with young voters than Joe Biden. Young voters, so fed up. Obviously, part of it has to do with the Israel policy. Though whether Trump would have a different Israel policy is kind of impossible to tell. But Trump does speak somehow, even with his less, I think, thought out foreign policy, or kind of moves from one consensus to another, at some points attacking interventionism, but then also picking like John Bolton to be his national security advisor. I think there is a belief, maybe it's just a hope, that Trump cares more about America first, about the American worker, than Joe Biden's policies have evinced that he does.
Yeah. And to be clear, a lot of these young voters and black voters, they're not saying, I prefer Trump.
No.
And they get into that earlier in another place in the article.
They're just not going to vote.
But they don't want to vote for Joe Biden. And people are screaming, look, don't be mad. You see some of these pundits, the mainstream media pundit types, looking at these clips, looking at these interviews of young people and others saying that they're dissatisfied with Joe Biden, and they're huffing and they're rolling their eyes and they're saying, get a grip, what's the alternative? For over a year out from the election, the Democratic Party has said there will be no primary. We're going to ignore polls that say 70% of our own Democratic base doesn't want Joe Biden to be the nominee. They don't want Donald Trump to be the nominee either. But the Democratic Party only has control over one of those. And they are saying, you're going to take Biden and you're going to like it. And at the same time, the pundits that we watched in the clip are saying, well, Biden has to do a better job of selling it. Well, let's look at the job he actually has to do. He has been telling the American people that the reason he didn't fulfill any number of campaign promises, whether it was raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour, whether it was canceling student debt, whether it was the fuller Build Back Better package, they say, well, it wasn't our fault. We didn't have the votes. You came into office with a trifecta, a narrow trifecta, but a trifecta nonetheless. And you did not use your leverage to get Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema on board, even though now you're using your political leverage to go around Congress to ensure that Israel gets aid money without a congressional vote. And at the same time, you cannot say, well, it was the Supreme Court that ended the student debt policy, when it was your choice to turn on student loan payments less than a year before your election date, just a little over a year before your election date, when Donald Trump was the guy who used his executive authority to turn them off. Even if you couldn't get the policy through the courts in time, you absolutely did not have to choose to negotiate turning on those student debt payments as part of one of the, I think it was a debt ceiling negotiation a few months ago at the end of the summer. So these are all choices that he has to stand by, and he has to articulate to the American people why he was willing to fight so hard to send tax dollars overseas, but hasn't been willing to fight for people at home that are experiencing economic precarity. And the reason he isn't being able to make that pitch well is because it's simply not a good pitch.
And if they just had an actual primary and actual debates, and he still wins, okay, then he won the process. But it's like the Democratic Party is saying, no, you will take him, and you will be happy with that.
Right.
You will live with this.
Right.
Which is remarkably similar to how 2016 went down.
Yeah.
How 2016 went down.
And by the way, I also think that if there were debates, even if he blew the rest of the competition out of the water, it would be an opportunity for people to be reminded about what the Democratic Party affirmative agenda is. Right now, we're seeing Republicans get out there and make the case for what they believe in. Democrats don't have that same opportunity because they're simply not having a primary.
We'll have more Rising right after this.